Hi, everybody. Lovely to have you joining us. My name is Bradley Franks. I'm one of the growth and partnerships managers here at Applied, and wanted to thank you for taking your time out your day to join us for session 3 of our Beyond Unconscious Bias training workshops. Today, we are going to be focused on how to interview effectively without bias. We're going to be looking at how to effectively interview using scorecards, using structure, and most importantly, in a way that's super inclusive. So let's get to it. What are we going to be covering in the next 45 minutes or so? Well, 5 key things. First, we're going to look at the dangers of unstructured interviews. You might be using these already in your organization. You might not be interviewing in a way that's particularly rigorous. We'll look at why that's a problem. Second, we'll touch on the specifics around groupthink and how groupthink really influences the way that we make hiring decisions and the way we make decisions as panels. Third, and the real kind of nuts and bolts of the session, is we're going to be looking at how to structure interviews. Why should you structure them? What does it look like? How do we keep information relevant? What sort of marking rubric should we be using, and how should you be coming up with your own? Before fourth, turning towards the benefits of structuring those interviews. What sort of results would we expect for you to see in terms of accuracy and diversity improvements? And then finally, a little word on metrics and reporting. So in terms of the dangers of unstructured interviews, and what we mean by unstructured interviews are the sorts of interviews where you get in a room and you say to a candidate, so tell me about yourself, and they go on a ramble. You say, so tell me whatever question springs to mind, and you dive straight in. The sort of 4 key downsides to this, which we covered in our first session when we looked at bias in more depth. The first is the role of confirmation bias. So if you go into an interview and you ask different candidates different questions, what you'll often be doing is reaffirming an initial impression you have. If a candidate seems like they're really high performing, you might ask them positive-led questions that lead for them to really show their skill set and demonstrate where they are a good fit, to reaffirm that impression. The inverse is true if you have a negative perception of a candidate. The second is you're often going to experience what's known as the peak end effects around interviewing. So you'll remember only the most salient parts, often the start and the end, and the middle is sort of a mishmash of, okay, you know, this candidate might have been good, but I can't quite remember, and everything sort of blurs into one. I think the third thing, and this is where we see a lot of early stage organizations, particularly startups, hiring wrong, is moving towards affinity bias. It's easy to get along with someone and build a favorable impression of a candidate's quality when actually what you've just done is have a really good conversation. And finally, that itself often lends to what's known as the halo effect, where you have one part of the interview that seems like it's going really well, and that leads for everything else in the interview that might not have been as high quality to be met with rose-tinted glasses. And the inverse is true in the instance of Horn effects. So take a quick second to think about some of the biases that you might have encountered when you were doing your interviews, particularly if you've used unstructured interviews. Now, I think what comes with interviewing more generally and the territory that organizations interview in are 3 key problems. You've got the overestimation of competency, first and foremost, where people think they're exceptional interviewers, and sometimes there are exceptional interviewers in organizations, but not everybody can be an exceptional interviewer. There's an overestimation of competency that we tend to see. The second is there's often a lack of accountability. Interviewing is sort of this mic drop moment where someone makes a hire and they leave and they say, great, we've done it now, it's completed. There's not accountability as to who's making what decisions. And finally, there's the wrong priorities. Often we evaluate for culture fit, we get fixated on prior experience, logos, feelings of ease, affinity, and we don't test for skill set effectively. So let's talk a little bit about groupthink. Groupthink is where we're all led by the group, and it's an example of a bias that happens where we don't individually score any part of an interview process. So what you'll often find is you can fall into these sort of bias traps. Pressure conformity, where the most senior person is in the room is often the most vocal, and people being more silent are ignored or are taken to be agreeable when actually they're not. If group members liked a candidate, they feel like they can take risk. Invulnerability is something that exists in the form of groupthink. Another one would be faux unanimity, where we assume there's agreement just because there's silence. And all of these biases mean that when we do interview without structure, and we do interview in a way that's not rigorous, the chances are that we're going to hire similar people to that which exists in the group. We'll also default to making the safe option, which more often than not, if we have an area of the organization that's lacking diversity, looks much like the organization that you've already built. So the first thing that we would say when looking towards interviewing effectively is that you should be using interviews to gather information. You should not be using interviews for making a decision, at least initially. You shouldn't be thinking, this candidate's so great, this candidate's so rubbish in the first 4 or 5 minutes of the interview. You shouldn't be getting them to re-explain their resume to you. You shouldn't be getting them to explain the work samples if you're using the applied methodology that they've done. Because we know that if you have a preconceived idea of whether a candidate is good or bad, that will unduly influence your decision and wholly bias your interview process. Now, the main thing that's wrong with unstructured interviews is decisions are made far too quickly. Most studies suggest that the average decision in an interview is made in less than 4 minutes. That's a study that was done by Ambady and Rosenthal. Prickett and Gardajayan suggests that the first 10 seconds of an interview could predict its outcome. So actually, the baseline to having a really effective interview process is to ensure that the candidates that you've shortlisted are competent, and that requires using work samples, which we covered in our second session, but it also requires having trust in the hiring process that you're introducing. So structured interviews, why use them? Quick recap. This is one of the main studies that we leverage here at Applied. It's taken from a Schmidt-Hunter study that looks at 85 years of research into different assessment methods. And what we see here is that structured, scorecarded interviews are a significantly better indicator of performance than unstructured ones. And they can also improve the representation of candidates that are underrepresented in certain backgrounds. So there's 3 things that a structured interview does. And if you do these properly, you will avoid the biases that we've touched on now. The first is you ask all candidates the same set of questions. Everyone is being asked the same things. Yes, you can dive deeper. Yes, you can go into more detail, ask follow-ups, prompt, nudge, etc. But all structured interviews should be asking candidates the same questions. Now, the second thing that's really important is that you take notes, and that everyone takes notes and does so consistently, whilst giving each candidate's answer an independent score that they've given the candidate. You don't want groupthink. You don't want one single score that you make as a group once you've looked at your notes. You all want to be scoring independently. And that leads to the final point, the final thing that we would recommend using for interview, which is consistency in measurement. You need the same yardstick. We recommend a Likert scale, 1, 3, and 5 stars. And we'll be discussing what a consistent measurement process could look like a little bit later in this session. But the most important thing is you're all on the same page when looking at what good or bad looks like. Now, few misconceptions around structured interviews. They're not robotically asking candidates a list of questions without dialogue or conversation. You can still take time to put candidates at ease, and actually in putting some candidates at ease before and explaining, hey, this is the part where we have a conversation. How was your journey? How did you commute in? Where are you coming from? That sort of thing can reduce stereotype threat. It's stereotype threat being where you feel as though you don't belong in a particular room or in a particular place, and you have that feeling reaffirmed by the environment that you're in. Structured interviews help set clear boundaries around what is being assessed and what's not. And they're not particularly radical. Like Google use them. Most organizations want to use them and are moving towards that general direction. But we believe that really all organizations should be using structured interviews. So when you're making a decision, one of the things that we've seen in the work that we do with organizations is people on interview panels don't always tend to, strictly speaking, focus on what's in front of them, which means that when making a decision, there's a lot of cognitive noise. What's important is you ask the right sort of questions. So I want you to take a second to think. Imagine this scenario. You're a CV, you're a VC founder, and you're seeking funding, and you're going to, or you're a VC-backed founder, and you're going back to different sets of VCs, venture capital firms, and you're seeking funding. Which question, when coming up with your business plan, would you rather be asked? How do you plan to monetize this? How long will it take to break even? Just a couple of seconds to think about that. Now, I know which question I would rather be asked. And that's because the question on how you plan to monetize this is a promotional focus question. It focuses on potential gain, whereas the question on how long it will take to break even is a prevention focused question. It focuses on potential losses or mitigating them. Now, this is taken from an actual study that was done that looked at how investors ask male entrepreneurs more promotion focused questions and how investors ask more female entrepreneurs prevention focused questions. So VCs would frame questions to founders in different ways that often tried to assess the same sort of topics. If you were asking about customer acquisition, you might say, how do you want to acquire more customers? Whereas if you were to ask a prevention focused question, you would say, how many active users do you have? What could get in the way of you reaching the goals around X, Y, Z milestones? Now, really important to consider not just why you should have consistency when using structured interviews, but also important to consider what's the balance of prevention versus promotion focused questions. One of the things that we would advise doing is setting more promotion focused questions at the start so as to put candidates at ease. And then towards the end, you can focus on your prevention focused questions. So the headline there is, in the past, in tech and funding, fundraising and finance, we've asked men to win, we've asked women not to lose. Now comes into the sort of show, don't tell approach of how to frame questions effectively. We know that focusing on experience is a fairly limited predictor of performance. And a better alternative is to get people to focus on what they would do, focus on situations. And that's because if you have great experience, you will know how to approach a particular situation and do so very well. If you've got experience that's not led for you to demonstrate that skill set, you might not be a great fit for the role. On the contrary, just because you don't have an experience or have the experience doing a particular part of a role that you're assessing somebody in, doesn't mean that you wouldn't be able to demonstrate that in the form of a hiring process. So what we recommend doing is taking a show, don't tell approach, where if you were hiring a salesperson, don't get them to talk to you about a time they've sold a particular software product. Have them come in and, as part of their interview process, do a 10-minute pitch on a particular software product. If you're hiring engineers, have them come in as part of the interview process and do some programming. You get the idea. The idea is that you should have candidates getting as close to demonstrating what the role looks like as humanly possible. In terms of keeping it relevant, we touched on this earlier. Humans are not very good at multitasking or processing lots of information. We might think that more information is better when we make hiring decisions, but more often than not, it's a complete distraction. So in a set of studies, what was actually looked at, it was a study done by Dana et al. In 2013. They looked at people's ability to predict like student GPA scores, which is how you mark grades in US colleges. And what was found was you gave one group of people past GPA scores and said, now predict the future scores that these same candidates will have. They had their mocks and their past performance. You gave another group the same scores and then irrelevant information based on a random response system. And what was found was that the group that had less information, but that was more relevant, did better at predicting the overall scores. So what does that actually mean in practice? It means our brains can't process information overload, and the questions you should be asking should be relevant to the role. They shouldn't be about things that don't matter. when it comes to doing things effectively. So how do we keep it relevant? Well, we should be structuring our interviews, goes without saying. We should be getting rid of the CV and banishing things like hobbies, extracurricular activities, that sort of thing. We should make sure that we've got a marking rubric when it comes to scoring candidates' applications. And finally, we don't need to know how a candidate's performed in other rounds. All we should know is how well is this candidate doing in this particular part of the assessment process. In terms of reducing bias, we've touched on most of these as key important points. Scoring separately, having 3 reviewers, and we'll touch on why. Having 3 people in your interview is really important. Making sure that you're all submitting your scores before discussion, and where you can, having a diverse panel wherever possible. Everybody that's on that panel should also know the questions that are being asked and should have an idea of the marking criteria going into the interview itself. You might have seen this study before in one of the earlier sessions we ran, but we know time of day has a really big influence on when we make decisions. We're far more inclined to not give people parole when making decisions before breaks in our judicial systems, and we're far more inclined to be harsh with our decision making and snappier when making decisions at the end of the day. So one thing to consider is time of day. Don't cram interviews in right before lunch. Don't do them right at the end of the day. Spread them out. Now, crowd wisdom is a thing that's thrown around quite a lot. You should use the crowd. You should use the crowd. You shouldn't fall prone to groupthink. I mentioned 3 people as being the optimum number for interviewing, but why have we chosen that number specifically? What you're looking at here is an awfully presented study, but actually it's very interesting, taken from Laszlo Bock, his book, What Works, which is all about the pioneering work he did at Google. I'd highly recommend it. What was found in a study was how accurate an individual would think Google would hire somebody based off, looking at individuals that would be completing those interviews. So in terms of the results from the study overall, what was found in the first few interviews that people do is they either get the accuracy of the interviews completely bang on. 100% of the people interviewing could with 100% accuracy predict that Google want to hire them, or they get it terribly wrong. They get none of the interviewing accuracy decisions right. Now, there was one person who did really well once they'd completed 50, 100, 120 interviews, and that's someone that still works at Google called Nelson Abramson. Over time, what was found was the average accuracy of the interviews sort of hovered around 55%. So when you have one interviewer, the average accuracy of the interview is 55%. Now, when you introduced 3 or more interviewers, the average accuracy of the interview went up to 86%. That's 1.6 times greater interviewing accuracy. Now, you might be thinking, oh, but what about Nelson? Nelson interviewed by himself and was very much so more accurate than when you have 3 people in an interview of predicting top performance. That's true, but not everyone in the organization can be Nelson. So what's really important is that if you only have one person doing a first round interview, you should know that you are likely averaging missing out on about 1/3 of the candidates that you're interviewing. Now, you might have Nelsons in your organization. You might have people that think they're amazing at interviewing. Use them to come up with marking rubrics and use them to sit on interview panels. Because if an organization is scaling, you can't have one person that's responsible for managing the entire interview process. So the outcome from this section is that you should be using small groups and have 3 interviewers in each round, particularly in the first round, so that you make sure you're not losing top talent. Now, if you're using work samples, you won't be needing to do anywhere near as many rounds of interview, so that won't be as much time taken up. I think the benefits for unstructured interviews sort of speak to themselves, and I think we've spoken to this point quite a lot already. They're more consistent, they're measurable, they're efficient, and the key thing is you can go back and track how your interviews are going and improve them long term. They're not this repetitive thing that keep happening time and time again without any improvement. They're also just more evidently fairer. Now, one of the things that we would recommend with interviews moving over to Zoom increasingly is being mindful of the way in which you navigate interviews through video format. So if the Zoom was crashing, take time to reflect and consider, was I marking that interview down because that candidate's internet was really poor? Take your time to consider, that instant connection probably won't be there, and you should leave an extra quarter of an hour for things to go wrong. You want to be setting candidates at ease. I think reflection and not necessarily submitting your scores immediately after, submit them before a discussion, is something we've seen of real value at Applied, and our clients have too. And finally, reducing the amount of back-to-back interviews. Like, Zoom fatigue is real. It will impact your judgment. It will get in the way of making rigorous decisions. So being mindful of how you go about doing that, really important. In terms of metrics, there's 3 sort of stages that we see organizations moving towards when it comes to understanding how they're interviewing and how they're managing their hiring processes more effectively. The first are those that have no metrics whatsoever. This is where some early stage organizations are. It's typically where your company or organization doesn't capture any data, certainly doesn't analyze it when it comes to hiring process. Often those without dedicated talent, HR functions, or specialist recruitment technology solutions in, like Applied, they'll be here. Then you've got where the vast majority of organizations are, which is transactional, being transactional in terms of the metrics that they have in place. Often seen as like vanity metrics. You might focus on things like volumes of applicants, cost per hire, time to hire, looking very much so at efficiency in the process rather than predictivity and effectivity and being effective rather. So the final step that we see is moving towards predictive recruitment, which is much more around looking at the quality of the process and the outcomes of that process from a business perspective. So you might focus on interview to offer rate. How many interviews are we doing versus how many offers are we making? You may look at quality of hire by focusing on retention, or you might be focused on improving your equality, diversity, inclusion by looking at the diversity of your funnel. So instead of saying, okay, time to hire is the most important thing, but 20% of the hires you make are no longer there in 2 years because they're not a good fit, you might look at interview to offer rates combined with retention rates as a way to improve your process. And I think what this all looks like once you have those metrics is empowering yourself to create change in the organization as an HR or people or talent leader. You move from saying being efficient is the most important thing to I'm using data to work on what really matters. And that means that the wider organization often takes a step back and says, person in this role really understands what they're doing. I trust them with whatever best practices they're looking to introduce. Now, in terms of actually using predictivity in your hiring process overall, what we would recommend is tracking your diversity data. So making sure that you know where your best candidates are being sourced from in your hiring process. And you can do all of that through Applied, but you can also use what's known as a UTM link to track your sourcing data effectively. You can then turn towards looking at diversity drop-off rates throughout your hiring process. Yes, our system automatically reports on that, but you can do it yourself using a spreadsheet and making sure that you're collecting data effectively. One of the things that we do through Applied is we enable you to track socio-demographic drop-off rates. So you might say, for instance, the ratio of men and women being somewhat equal in representation when submitting work samples drastically decreases at the second stage of interview. Now, if you have that data, you'll be able to track that drop-off rate and then look at the questions you're asking and improve on your process long term. We do track through our tech the candidate experience and what candidates think after they've applied, after they've been rejected, and after they've been hired. But what you can do is simply use a Google form or a Doodle poll and ask candidates to give you collaborative feedback on how they found the process and where they think improvements could be. We know that employer branding as a whole is massively important for B2C companies, but we also know that candidates will be more inclined to reapply for a role at your organization, even if they were unsuccessful once they've been able to upskill, and you want to keep that door open for yourselves. So in terms of actually wrapping up, we know that this sort of process, if you're using the work samples, you're using structured scorecarded interviews, and you're also collecting data, you should see the sort of benefits that we are delivering through our system. Up to a 4 times improvement in the representation of people of colour, ensuring that 60% of candidates that we know through traditional hiring processes don't get missed out on, and offering a really smooth candidate experience that candidates love. We've actually surpassed 500,000 applications going through a process that looks just like that which we outlined, and on average rating it 9 out of 10, even amongst those that are marked as unsuccessful. Now, often we hear the pushback, if you will, of, but what about female candidates? There's not as many female candidates in tech. That's why we're struggling to recruit them. Well, that's not necessarily true. There's less female engineers. That is true, but that shouldn't mean that you can't hire as many female candidates. What we've seen through Applied is a 15% increase on the proportion of female candidates actually being hired off the back of simply removing identifying information, focusing on scorecarded interviews, and taking a show, don't tell approach. So if you are interested in learning more, we've whizzed through this session. We're happy to cover any of these themes in more depth in an introductory conversation and see if Applied could be right for you. But do feel free to keep in touch with us, download our additional resources from our website, sign up to our newsletter, and follow us on social media. I hope that this session was insightful and that you got something out of it. But do feel free, as with any of our free content, to drop us a note, give us feedback, let us know how you found it. And thank you so much for your time. Hope to see you at an event soon. All the best.